The fluorescent lights of Thorne Arch hummed with a clinical, low-frequency buzz that always seemed to vibrate in Elara's teeth. It was 9 p.m. The cleaning crew had already finished the executive floor, leaving the scent of lemon bleach and expensive floor wax lingering in the air. Elara smoothed her thumb over the edge of the heavy vellum blueprints. Her palms were damp. She adjusted her oversized gray sweater, pulling the sleeves over her knuckles, a nervous habit she couldn't seem to break. "Julian?" she whispered, knocking softly on the mahogany door of the corner office. "Come," a rich, effortless voice called out. Julian Thorne was framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Chicago skyline. He didn't look like a man who had worked a 12-hour day. His white dress shirt was crisp, his silk tie loosened just enough to look rugged rather than messy. When he turned, the city lights caught the gold in his hair. He smiled, that dazzling, lopsided grin that had made Elara fall for him the moment she started her internship. "Still here, Elara?" he asked, walking toward her. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture that usually made her heart flutter, but tonight it felt heavy. "I finished the sustainability proposal, Julian, the urban canopy project. Julian, if we pitch this to the city council, it won't just change the skyline, it'll change the environment. It's profitable and it's revolutionary." Julian glanced at the drawings for all of 10 seconds. He didn't look at the calculations or the innovative irrigation systems she'd spent months perfecting in her spare time. He just sighed, a patronizing sound that felt like a pat on the head. "It's adorable, Elara, really. You have such a creative heart," he said, sliding the blueprints back toward her. "But let's be realistic. You're a brilliant assistant, you keep my life running, and you polish my presentations until they shine. But this is big league architecture. It requires a certain vision, a certain weight. You're just not there yet." Elara felt a cold prickle at the back of her neck. "I did the math, Julian. The vision is right there on the page." He walked behind her, leaning down to whisper near her ear. "Stick to what you're good at, Elle. Supporting me. We're a team, right?" 3 hours later, Elara stood in the shadows of the mezzanine at the Drake Hotel. The Thorne Arch annual gala was a sea of black tuxedos and shimmering silk. She had worn her best dress, a simple navy wrap, but standing among the socialites, she felt like a smudge of charcoal on a diamond. She had come to find Julian, to tell him she'd rethink the proposal if he'd just look at it again. She spotted him near the bar, surrounded by his inner circle, men who had gone to the same Ivy League schools and inherited the same effortless arrogance. "So where's the little shadow tonight?" one of them asked, laughing. "The one who carries your bags." Julian swirled the scotch in his glass, the ice clinking like a death knell. "Elara? She's home, I imagine, probably doodling more trees on skyscrapers." "She's a cute thing," another man remarked. "Are you actually serious about her, or is she just office perks?" Julian's laugh was light, dismissive, and cut through Elara like a serrated blade. "Elara is convenient. She's sweet, and she handles the grunt work better than anyone. But let's be real. She's not someone you take to the finish line, professionally or socially. She's just not good enough to be a Thorne." The world seemed to go silent. Elara stared at his back, the broad shoulders she had leaned on, the man she had loved in the quiet hours of the morning. She didn't cry. Instead, a strange, icy heat began to radiate from her chest. She looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. She turned and walked out of the gala, the clicking of her heels on the marble floor sounding like a countdown. By the time she reached the coat check, she had already sent the email. "I quit. Effective immediately. Keep the blueprints. You'll need them to see what you're losing." She walked out into the biting Chicago wind, the oversized sweater long gone, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing. She was never going to be convenient again. The air in the headquarters of Vance Global didn't smell like lemon bleach and desperation. It smelled of filtered oxygen, expensive espresso, and the faint metallic tang of cutting-edge technology. The walls were matte black and living moss, a literal manifestation of the urban canopy Elara had once been told was doodling. Elara Vance stood before the floor-to-ceiling glass of her penthouse office, overlooking the Chicago River. She wasn't wearing an oversized sweater. Today, she wore a tailored, cream-colored silk suit that fit like armor. Her hair, once a messy tangle, was cut into a sharp, chin-length bob. She checked her reflection in the glass. The softness was gone. In its place was a woman who had spent 5 years sleeping 4 hours a night, pitching to skeptical venture capitalists and outworking every man who had ever looked past her. "Ms. Vance?" Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The representatives from the acquired firm are in boardroom A. Mr. Thorne is with them." Elara's heart did a strange, localized skip, not of affection, but of a predator spotting its mark. "Thank you, Sarah. Give them 5 minutes to get uncomfortable, then bring me my coffee." She waited exactly 6. When Elara walked into boardroom A, the conversation died instantly. The room was filled with the remaining board members of Thorne Arch, gray-haired men who looked like they'd been hit by a freight train. And then there was Julian. He was sitting at the far end of the table, staring at a leather-bound folder. He looked older. The golden boy tan had faded into a stressed pallor, and there were fine lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago. His suit was still expensive, but the cuffs were a little frayed, a silent scream of a crumbling empire. Julian stood up instinctively as she entered, the habit of a gentleman, but then he froze. His jaw literally dropped. The folder in his hand slipped an inch. "Good morning, gentlemen," Elara said, her voice like silk over gravel. She didn't look at Julian. She walked to the head of the table, the seat of power, and sat down. "Elara?" Julian's voice was a ragged whisper. She tilted her head, her expression one of polite, professional confusion. "I'm sorry, I believe you mean Ms. Vance. We haven't been on first-name basis for half a decade, Mr. Thorne." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. One of the older board members cleared his throat. "Julian, you know our new owner?" "She was an intern," Julian stammered, his eyes searching Elara's face for a trace of the girl who used to bring him coffee. "She was a junior designer at Thorne Arch." "I was a lot of things at Thorne Arch. Most of them involve labor you didn't pay for and ideas you didn't understand. But today, I am the woman who just bought your debt for 60 cents on the dollar." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. Julian looked as if he wanted to bolt from the room, but he was trapped by the reality of his bank account. "The merger is finalized," Elara continued. "Thorne Arch will be absorbed as a subsidiary of Vance Global. Most of your senior staff will be let go. However," she paused, letting the word hang, "we are keeping a small design team to handle the legacy projects, including Julian." Julian's shoulders slumped, a mixture of relief and profound humiliation. "You're keeping me on?" "As a senior architect," she said, "you'll report directly to me. Your office has been moved." "To which floor?" Julian asked, trying to reclaim a sliver of his dignity. "To the bullpen on the 4th floor," Elara said, a small, cold smile playing on her lips. "It's an open-plan office. I find it helps junior talents develop the necessary vision.
You'll be handling the irrigation schematics for the new Heights project. It's grunt work, but as you once told me, you should stick to what you're good at." Julian's face went from pale to a deep, burning red. The board members looked at their shoes. 5 years ago, he had told her she wasn't good enough to be a Thorne. Now, he wasn't even good enough for a private office in her building. "I'll have my assistant show you to your cubicle," Elara said, standing up. "Welcome to Vance Global, Mr. Thorne. Try not to be late tomorrow. We have a lot of trees to doodle." She walked out without looking back, her heels clicking a rhythmic, victorious beat against the marble floor. Only when she was back in the sanctuary of her own office did she allow herself to breathe. Her hands were trembling, but she balled them into fists. The reversal was complete. But as she looked down at the street level, seeing the tiny figure of Julian Thorne walking towards the elevators, she realized the sting hadn't entirely vanished. The power reversal was a start, but the real work, the real confrontation, was only just beginning.
The fourth floor of Vance Global was a hive of activity, a landscape of white desks, ergonomic chairs, and the constant hum of collaboration. In the center of it all sat Desk 42. Julian Thorne looked out of place. He was a man built for private elevators and mahogany-lined sanctuaries. Yet here he was, pinned between a 24-year-old structural engineer with neon green headphones and a water cooler that gurgled every 3 minutes. From the glass-walled mezzanine above, Elara watched him. She told herself she was monitoring her investment, but her eyes lingered longer than necessary. Julian wasn't lounging. He wasn't on his phone. He was hunched over a dual-monitor setup, his tie discarded on the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked exhausted, but he also looked focused in a way she had never seen back at Thorne Arch. Back then, he had glided. Now he was digging. "He's been there since 6 a.m., Sarah, her assistant, said as she set a tablet on Elara's desk. "And he stayed until midnight yesterday. The cleaning crew said he was the only one left on the floor." Elara tightened her grip on her coffee cup. "He's trying to save face, Sarah. He knows the board is looking for any excuse to cut him loose entirely." "Maybe," Sarah murmured, "but he's also finished the irrigation schematics for the Heights project, 3 days ahead of schedule, and Elara, they're perfect." Elara felt a flicker of something, not pride, but a stubborn recognition of his talent. "Send him up. Let's see if his vision has improved." 10 minutes later, Julian stood in her office. He didn't wait for her to tell him to sit. He remained standing, holding a physical portfolio. It was a subtle shift in power. He no longer assumed the room belonged to him. "The schematics," he said, laying them out. "I took the liberty of cross-referencing them with the new city rainfall data. If we adjust the filtration layers here," he pointed to a section of the rooftop garden design, "we can reduce the weight by 15% without losing any efficiency." Elara looked at the drawings. They were meticulous, but more than that, they were humble. He hadn't tried to put his signature Thorne flair on them, he had simply made her design better. "Why?" she asked, her voice cold. Julian met her gaze. His blue eyes, once so bright with arrogance, were shadowed. "Because you were right, Elara. 5 years ago, I didn't look at the math. I didn't look at the soul of the project. I just looked at who was holding the pen." He took a step closer, then stopped himself. "I'm not trying to win you back. I know I lost that right at the Drake Hotel. I'm just trying to prove that I'm worth the desk you gave me." Elara felt the ice around her heart vibrate. She wanted to snap at him, to remind him of the office perks comment, but the words died in her throat. He wasn't fighting her anymore. He was yielding. "The Riverside Commons contract is up for review tomorrow. It's a $30 million deal. If we win this, we control the city's skyline for the next decade. I need the final presentation deck by 5 p.m. "I'll have it ready," Julian said. But the old Julian wasn't entirely gone. He was still a man used to being the hero, and that instinct was a dangerous thing. The next morning, the boardroom was packed. City officials, investors, and the Vance Global Board sat in heavy silence. Elara opened the presentation, but as the slides progressed, she realized something was wrong. The budget figures had been altered, the structural materials had been swapped for a high-end experimental bioglass that hadn't been fully vetted for the Chicago wind tunnels. Julian had gone rogue. He had stayed up all night improving the pitch, thinking a grander, more expensive vision would guarantee the win. "Mr. Thorne," a city planner said, leaning forward, "this bioglass, the cost is nearly double the original projection. We're a municipality, not a luxury developer. How do you justify this?" Julian stood, his old confidence surging. "It's a statement piece. It puts Chicago on the map for the next century. The long-term durability is untested," the planner interrupted. "Ms. Vance, your firm was chosen because of your reputation for sustainable, practical brilliance. This looks like Thorne Arch vanity." The room went cold. Elara looked at the screen, then at Julian. He looked back at her, a desperate "trust me" written in his eyes. He thought he was helping. He thought he was giving her the weight he once claimed she lacked. Instead, he was sinking them both. "We need a moment," Elara said, her voice a sharp blade that cut through the murmurs. Once the room cleared, leaving only Elara and Julian, the explosion she'd been holding back for 5 years finally arrived. "What did you do?" she hissed, slamming her laptop shut. "I tried to make it undeniable, Elara. I wanted to give you the biggest win of your career," Julian shouted back, his frustration finally boiling over. "I saw an opportunity to make the project legendary." "I don't need legendary from you. I needed correct." She stepped into his space, her finger poking his chest. "You still don't get it. You still think you're the one who needs to save the project. You haven't changed at all. You're still the same arrogant boy who thinks your vision is the only one that matters." "I did it for you," Julian roared. "You did it for your ego," Elara countered. "The board wants you fired, Julian. They've been waiting for this, and honestly, I don't think I have a single reason to stop them." Julian flinched as if she'd struck him. The silence that followed was deafening. He looked at the blueprints on the table, the ones he had fixed, and for the first time, the light of the golden boy completely extinguished. "You're right," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought I could make up for it all with one big gesture. I'm sorry, Elara. I'll have my desk cleared by noon." He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped, looking every bit like the man whose empire had crumbled. Elara watched him reach the door. This was it, the ultimate victory. She had stripped him of his pride, his position, and now his career. She had won. But as she looked at the empty seat at the head of the table, she didn't feel like a queen. She felt like she was standing in the cold again, wearing an oversized sweater, watching the only person who truly understood her doodles walk out of her life for good. "Julian," she called out, her voice trembling. He stopped, but didn't turn around. "Don't clear your desk yet," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "We have 20 minutes before the planners come back. Sit down. We're fixing this my way." The 20 minutes that followed were a blur of frantic clicking, hushed commands, and the sharp scent of ozone from the overheating projector. Elara sat at the center of the table, her fingers flying across her laptop, while Julian stood beside her, leaning over her shoulder to adjust the CAD models with a surgeon's precision. "The bioglass is out. Revert to the recycled polymer blend," Elara commanded, her voice a steady drumbeat. "It's lighter, it's half the cost, and it doesn't need the reinforced struts." "Done," Julian said, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. He was focused solely on the screen. "I'm rerouting the runoff channels to the secondary garden. It'll handle the wind tunnel drag better." "Good," Don't touch the budget. Keep it at the original 30 million. We need to prove we're responsible, not just flashy." They worked in a strange electric harmony. For the first time in 5 years, the air between them wasn't thick with resentment or posturing. It was filled with the raw energy of creation. Julian didn't argue. He didn't try to save her. He simply followed her lead, lending his technical mastery to her vision. When the door opened and the city planners filed back in, Elara didn't stand up. She stayed seated at the head of the table, her hands flat on the mahogany surface. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice echoing with a quiet authority that silenced the room. "The figures you saw earlier were an internal exploration of material possibilities. They are not the Vance Global proposal. This is." She hit the enter key. The screen bloomed with a 3D rendering of the Riverside Commons. It wasn't a shimmering, ego-driven monument of glass. It was a breathing, green sanctuary. Vines trailed down the sides of the structure, integrated into the very skin of the building. It looked like it belonged to the earth, a masterpiece of sustainable engineering. This building doesn't just sit in the city, it breathes with it. It filters the air, it manages its own waste. It is built for the people who will live in its shadow, not the architects who want their names on a plaque. Beside her, Julian stood silent, his arms crossed. He didn't say a word, but when the head planner looked at him, Julian simply nodded toward Elara, a clear, public acknowledgement of her ownership. The silence lasted for a long, agonizing minute. Then the head planner smiled, a slow, genuine expression of relief. "This, Ms. Vance, this is the vision we were looking for." An hour later, the boardroom was empty. The contract had been signed, the champagne had been toasted, and the board members had retreated to their offices, buzzing with the news of the win. Elara stood by the window, watching the sun dip below the Chicago skyline, painting the clouds in bruised purples and burnt oranges. She heard the soft click of the door closing. Julian hadn't left. "You should be at the bar with the others," she said, not turning around. "You saved the technical side of that pitch." "I almost ruined it, Elara," he said, his voice thick, lacking the polished edge he had carried since the day she met him. "I almost lost everything for you again." She turned. He was standing by the table, looking at the blueprints. The golden boy was truly gone. In his place was a man who looked like he'd finally seen his own reflection and didn't like the person staring back. "Why did you do it, Julian? The bioblast, the ego. Why?" Julian looked up, his eyes glassy. "Because I was terrified," he whispered. "I've spent 5 years watching you grow into this titan, and I've spent those same 5 years losing everything I thought made me me. I thought if I could give you something spectacular, something Thorne-sized, you'd finally see me as an equal again." He took a jagged breath, shaking his head. "But today, watching you lead that room, I realized the truth. You weren't not good enough for me back then. I was just too small to handle how big you were going to be. I was threatened by you, Elara, even then." The apology didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a release. The icy heat that lived in Elara's chest for 5 years, the drive to prove him wrong, the fury of that night at the Drake Hotel, suddenly evaporated. She didn't need him to be small for her to feel big. "The desk on the 4th floor," she said softly. "It was petty of me." Julian let out a short, dry laugh. "It was deserved. I needed to see what it was like to start from the bottom. I needed to see how hard you worked while I was busy being conveniently brilliant." He moved toward the door, stopping with his hand on the handle. "I'll have my resignation on your desk by morning. You don't need a senior architect who lacks the discipline to follow your lead." "Julian," she called out. He stopped, his back to her. "I don't want your resignation," she said, walking toward him. She stopped a few feet away, her silk suit shimmering in the twilight. "I want a partner, not a Thorne partner, a Vance Global partner, someone who knows the math and respects the vision." Julian turned, his expression of unbelief. "You'd trust me? After today?" I trust the man who stayed until midnight to get the irrigation right, and I trust the woman I've become to know when someone is worth the second chance." 2 months later, Elara sat in her corner office, the Queen of Sustainable Design title now solidified by the success of the Riverside project. The city was talking about the Vance-Thorne partnership, but everyone knew whose name came first. A soft knock sounded on her door. Julian entered, not with a portfolio or a crisis, but with 2 cups of coffee. He set one on her desk, black, 2 sugars, exactly how she liked it. He didn't have to ask, he had paid attention. He leaned against the edge of her desk, a comfortable, respectful distance away. He looked younger now, the stress lines smoothed by a new kind of purpose. "The blueprints for the new Tokyo project just came in," he said, gesturing to the tablet in her hand. "The board is asking if we should go with the vertical forest or the modular design." He looked at her, his eyes bright with a genuine curiosity that made her heart skip a beat, not out of the old, naive crush, but out of a new, grounded respect. "What's next, boss?" he asked, a small, knowing smile on his lips. Elara took a slow sip of the coffee. It was perfect. She looked out at the skyline they were reshaping together, the city reflecting in her eyes. She felt the weight of her power, and for the first time, it didn't feel like armor. It just felt like home. "Whatever I decide, Julian," she said, her voice calm and absolute. "Whatever I decide."